The case of Isaac Apodaca centers on the October 2022 death of 21-year-old Grace Jennings in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Prosecutors allege that Isaac Apodaca and his girlfriend, Kiara McCulley, planned and carried out Jennings' murder after luring her to their residence. Prosecution has relied on witness testimony, digital communications, internet search history, and forensic evidence to support their case. The defense challenges both the interpretation and reliability of key evidence. As with every criminal case, Isaac Apodaca is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in a court of law.
The defense, on behalf of Mr. Apodaca, has the right to make a closing statement to you. Counsel, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, thank you. We've been together now for a little over 2 weeks, if we include the initial jury selection. Do appreciate you. I've been noticing that all of you have been paying careful attention and taking notes. Last week, in opening statements, I told you that you would hear some testimony and see some evidence, but what you would not see is anything directly linking Isaac Apodaca to the crimes charged in this particular case. I do want to say one thing before I start with my presentation. Normally I do like to kind of get up close and personal, walk around and talk to you and kind of look you more directly in the eye, but because of the circumstances of this case and media involved and different things, I am limited to the podium. But the good thing about that for me is that I can kind of stay on script, and I have my script here. So I'm going to try not to go into too many asides and really just go into the important details of this particular case. This is, of course, a serious case. And you heard Ms. Murphy state that there were homicidal fantasies fueled by Isaac. That's what the state told you in their opening statement. Well, or closing statement. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence shows something totally different. The evidence shows that Kiara acted alone, and the government has not proven that Mr. Apodaca in any way was a knowing participant. And I'm going to go into that and I'm going to outline that. Isaac did not cause, aid, or encourage this killing by Kiara McCulley to take place, as the state would like you to believe, and as Ms. Murphy pointed out that you're going to hear a lot about cause, aid, or encourage. Well, that's not what happened here. The burden and presumption is that Isaac is presumed innocent, and the burden remains on the state at all times. Reasonable doubt is a doubt based on reason and common sense, and I'm sure you will employ your common sense when making your determinations here today. Attorney statements alone are not evidence. The evidence is testimony, exhibits, and stipulations. Isaac is presumed innocent until the government proves every required element of the crimes beyond a reasonable doubt. And Isaac has no burden to prove his innocence. It's on the state, and the state has to prove every element. Reasonable doubt may arise from what the evidence shows and from what the evidence does not show on material points. And as you'll see here, there are a lot of material points that does not point towards Isaac's guilt. The absence of DNA, fingerprints, blood, injuries, planning evidence, and conduct consistent with guilt is significant here. And it is reasonable doubt, clearly. You know, I kind of made that cheesy line in opening statement about I'm not going to stand up here like a used car salesman. The reason I brought that up was only to prove to you that I don't have to sell you on reasonable doubt in this case. It's clear. So I'm going to show you some jury instructions that you're going to go back into the jury room to go over. This will be jury instruction 3. You are the sole judges of the facts in this case. It is your duty to determine the facts from the evidence produced here in court. Your verdict should not be based on speculation, guess, or conjecture. Neither sympathy nor prejudice should influence your verdict. You are to apply the law as stated in these instructions to the facts as you find them, and in this way decide the case. Speculation, guess, or conjecture. You heard Ms. Murphy recap the state's case and discuss a lot of stuff about Isaac, but you also heard the testimony. And everything here is based on speculation, guess, conjecture in regards to some messages and perhaps some statements that Mr. Apodaca was coerced into adopting when a talented detective, Detective Vigil, cleverly framed a narrative for him to adopt. Another instruction you're going to have is instruction number 6. You alone are the judges of the credibility of the witnesses and the weight to be given to the testimony of each item. You able to see that clearly? In determining the credit to be given any witness, you should take into account his or her truthfulness or untruthfulness, his or her ability and opportunity to observe, his or her memory, his or her manner while testifying, any interest, bias, or prejudice he or she may have, and the reasonableness of his or her testimony considered in the light of all of the evidence in the case. Now, us attorneys like to use the word reasonable and reasonableness, but you heard, there were several witnesses who came here. There were some people who clearly had a bias, Laney McCulley, and we're going to get into Ms. McCulley's testimony and what she said when I recap and get into the specifics, the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of what was going on. But Laney McCulley certainly was here to protect her daughter, loved her daughter, and was concerned about her daughter and said what would suit her. And then you had other witnesses, certainly Kiara McCulley, and I'm sure you paid attention to that, the direct examination of the state of Ms. McCulley and my cross-examination. But there were several inconsistencies, and I'll get into the details, and she was prepped and had many different interviews, both with the state as well as police and her attorneys. But you have to look at the credibility, including opinions by experts. Dr. Wellner, we'll get into him, certainly a character, but you really have to look at what he testified to and what the weight of his testimony, whether it really is legitimate. Instruction number 10. You should consider each opinion received in evidence in this case and give it such weight as you think deserves. If you should conclude that the reasons given in support of the opinion are not sound, or for any other reason an opinion is not correct, you may disregard the opinion entirely. I think that's important when we're looking at all of the witnesses. And there were several opinions that were presented. Now, the state has to prove all of the elements of the crimes beyond a reasonable doubt, as we discussed in jury instructions. The first charge is for you to find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree, willful and deliberate, as charged in count 1. The state must prove to your satisfaction, beyond a reasonable doubt, each of the following elements of the crime. Defendant killed Grace Jennings. I'll acknowledge the state is trying to proceed here on accomplice liability. All right? But the defendant, as is agreed between us, one thing we'll agree with the state on, the defendant did not physically stab Grace Jennings to death. That was Kiara McCulley. So now we're basing everything on some messages, maybe a statement he made to the detective, Detective Vigil, and just various other circumstances and testimony, and then this grand old narrative by Dr. Wellner, who I'll get into more later, but Dr. Wellner didn't even sit down and discuss this with Mr. Apodaca or with Ms. McCulley. And the importance of that is that when you're trying to form an opinion, don't you have to form that opinion, especially when you're doing an expert opinion on matters such as coercion and control between two different individuals? Don't you have to sit down and talk to them up close and personal, know what's going on, know their, different quirks or different things that might make them susceptible or maybe not prone to coercion and control, or vice versa? How do we know that Kiara McCulley was not coercive and controlling over Isaac Apodaca? What evidence do we have one way or the other? What was going on? Actually, we have evidence through testimony and different things that Kiara was kind of running the ship. And Laney McCulley, her mom, somewhat controlling and kind of her mentor, raised her around swords and was a mentor to her. And Kiara actually lived out her fantasy, had a dream. She described the sword as being this beautiful sword. Element 2, the killing was with the deliberate intention to take away the life of Grace Jennings or any other human being. There's nothing here showing that Isaac Apodaca had any sort of deliberate intent, and I will get into the accomplice liability instruction here shortly. And then this happened in New Mexico on or about October 29th, 2022. We're not denying that the killing took place on October 29th, 2022. Now, the accomplice liability instruction, again, it says that the defendant intended that another person commit the crime. Did this defendant intend for Kiara McCulley to commit this crime. There's been absolutely no evidence beyond some crazy text messages that I'm going to get into and break down here that Isaac Apodaca intended for Kiara McCulley to commit this crime. Another person did commit this crime. We're acknowledging that Kiara McCulley committed this crime. And then the defendant helped, encouraged, or caused the crime to be committed. There's absolutely nothing. And I want you to carefully look over those messages. And I'm going to go over some of the messages, some of the specific messages, and explain to you why there's nothing showing that the defendant helped, encouraged, or in any way certainly caused this crime to be committed. Now, one thing that's important for you to, well, for me to discuss is if you find the defendant not guilty of first-degree murder, then there's his instruction as to second-degree murder. We don't believe defense, and I think it'll be pretty clear when you start deliberating that Mr. Apodaca is not guilty of murder at all here. But you do have to consider, and I do have to show you this, the instructions for second-degree murder. And this takes out the deliberate intent portion of the analysis. So the defendant killed Grace Jennings. The defendant knew that his acts created a strong probability of death or great bodily harm to Grace Jennings. Now, I do have the plea up here, and I'm going to show that to you in a bit, but Ms. McCulley's plea was to second-degree murder, and certainly she knew that there was a strong probability of death or great bodily harm to Grace Jennings. But nothing here shows that the defendant in any way had anything to do with wanting Grace Jennings dead and intending for this to happen. And then we would, of course, go back to the accomplice liability jury instructions in regards to encouraging and causing. And then there's also a charge of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, willful and deliberate, as charged in count 2. The state must prove to your satisfaction, beyond a reasonable doubt, each of the following elements of the crime. The defendant and another person, by words or acts, agreed together to commit murder in the first degree. The defendant and another person intended to commit murder in the first degree, and this happened in New Mexico on or about October 29, 2022. Absolutely nothing showing that the defendant intended to commit murder in the first degree and that there were words and acts as far as any sort of legitimate agreement. Okay, so I wanted to just go over those jury instructions with you because I think it's important for you to kind of understand when you're doing your analysis. But it's going to be pretty straightforward, as I'm pretty sure you will realize when you get to the deliberation room. Now, I do think it's important to show you this because there's a jury instruction in regards to how intent can be formed and different things. And with Dr. Wellner and the state has harped on this April 2022 dismissed charge. And I did introduce this, and this clearly shows that that was dismissed. And I think it's also important for you to understand that when you're evaluating Dr. Wellner's testimony. Because Dr. Wellner has no idea of the context of what was going on in April of 2022 other than his file review and testimony. I mean, pretty much he's regurgitating what was said, and he was, of course, paid, flew in here from Palm Beach, Florida, by the state, travels the country to testify when he's paid. And then he wants to make this grand analysis. The case in April 2022 was dismissed, and there is nothing anywhere in Dr. Wellner's analysis that can demonstrate that he actually knew what the context of that dismissal was and what was going on there. And then there's, of course, Kiara's plea, and she pled to second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and she had an incentive here to testify against Mr. Apodaca. Now, in regards to the conspiracy and the actual charge of murder, there was no proof, absolutely no proof, that Isaac was present for the killing. The case agent admitted no evidence that Isaac was in the garage when Grace was killed, and there was no evidence presented through any other witness. Isaac had no blood on him, no cuts on his hand. Sergeant Vijo couldn't remember any cuts on his hand, and there was no evidence of that. And there were no blood There was no blood on Mr. Apodaca's clothes. I think this is very important. I mean, don't you think with all that bloodshed and everything going on in that there would be some blood on Mr. Apodaca? No, absolutely none. Lainey McCulley didn't witness the garage events, did not see anyone being harmed by Isaac, had no personal knowledge of what happened in that garage. Lainey did not know whether the garage door was locked that morning. Kiara and Grace had a deteriorated relationship. Lainey agreed on the stand that Grace could easily provoke Kiara. The sword was associated with Kiara's Amazon account, and Kiara opened it in front of her mom. Everyone touching the sword when it arrived, but there's no fingerprints or any DNA linking Mr. Apodaca to the sword. Kiara McCulley's credibility before you here yesterday was like a lot longer than that, but here yesterday, her credibility is next to nil. She attributed extraordinary beliefs to Isaac, including that he was the Archangel Gabriel, and made wild statements that Isaac discussed a group called Ghost and described Ghost as a vigilante group that killed people who they considered to be bad. So, ladies and gentlemen, was absolutely ridiculous. Those claims may explain Kiara's current narrative, but they do not eliminate any sort of reasonable doubt as to Mr. Apodaca's involvement. Messages here do not equal proof beyond a reasonable doubt. State will rely on Facebook Messenger communications. Even if some of the messages were sent from Mr. Apodaca's account, the legal question here remains intent, assistance in any sort of agreement in regards to both counts. Isaac told police that some messages were sent by Kiara using his account from a second phone. They located a second phone, but nothing was removed from that extraction. Sergeant Vigil testified that the state later relied on Facebook records and phone logs to connect messages to Isaac's phone. You may consider that, but it's still not proof that every element was met beyond a reasonable doubt. In regards to investigation gaps, there were blood on the door. I asked Mr. Vigil about that, Detective Vigil, excuse me, if the blood on the door to the house was DNA tested, and it was not. The garage was messy, and it was basically an investigative decision not to leave every stone unturned. I mean, no stone should be unturned in an investigation like this, but a lot of evidence was not tested or even looked at. In a case like this, it's very important that all of the evidence is properly looked at. Ms. McCulley stated in her testimony that she could not hear screaming from the garage because it was 27 feet away.
Sir, I need you to sit down.
Okay. This tape measure is about 8.5 feet long. So we would be talking about from this door, from the door over here to right about here. We're talking 8.5 feet. If you multiply that by 3, I am pretty decent at math even though I'm a lawyer, but 8.5 by 3, that would be about 25.5 feet. You need about another 1.5 feet. So you're talking here, times 2 would be up to there, times 3 would be probably where y'all are sitting, and then maybe another foot or 2 would be the next row back there. So we're supposed to believe that Lady McCulley could not hear her daughter, Kiara McCulley, stabbing Grace to death with a sword which has her DNA on it. Right middle finger, DNA right here, palm right here on the left-hand side, holding it like this, at the very least, and then certainly she was stabbing Miss Jennings to death for 2 minutes. Let's take 2 minutes off the clock. It's 11:55. Stay silent till 11:57. All right, 11:57, 2 minutes. That was a long 2 minutes. Some of you didn't fall asleep there. But imagine those 2 minutes, 27 feet away. So we're talking basically from that door, roughly to the top row where you're sitting. And Kiara is actively stabbing Grace to death. You don't think that there was screaming, that there were loud noises. And during all this time, Ms. Laney McCulley, who clearly has a reason to protect her daughter, says she didn't hear anything. Now remember, Isaac called his mom, who called 911, and Isaac waited at the AP wireless store and was extremely cooperative with authorities. These gaps matter, ladies and gentlemen, because the state is asking you to reconstruct, essentially, circumstantially saying whether Mr. Apodaca somehow had intent or timing, presence, and participation, none of which is present here. Sergeant Vigil, in regards to the interrogation reliability, I'm not picking on Detective Vigil, excuse me. I mean, I think he's very talented at what he does. But these interrogations are not reliable. It's common tactics. I asked Dr. Wellner. He did provide some decent insight maybe into coerced interrogations, coerced confessions. I don't know necessarily Mr. Apodaca confessed, but he may have adapted to some of the stuff that Detective Vigil was talking about, because he was basically told to accept this narrative. And he didn't really feel like he had any other choice but to accept that narrative. Isaac cooperated, he answered questions, did not ask for counsel, he did not become confrontational. Sergeant Vigil had also told Isaac that he was going to go to jail before interviewing Kiara and before completing the investigation. Sergeant Vigil used pressure statements. You can hear from you can play that when you're in the deliberation room. Probably heard it when it was played before you. But Sergeant Vigil used pressure statements such as, "Dude, I'm not dumb, and it's over, own it." Sergeant Vigil at that time did not know whether Isaac was sleep deprived. He did not ask about medications or medical diagnosis. He was not trained to recognize psychological stress. He did not ask about education or reading difficulty or disabilities for that matter. Interrogation may show pressure and confusion, but nothing there properly states that Mr. Apodaca was in any way accepting anything in regards to responsibility in this case. He was just pressured into accepting a narrative. And the state also wants to make this whole argument about coercion and control. You saw him on that interview. Did he seem coercive and controlling at all? I mean, I hate to say this, but I think we're in the middle of July. I know it's a little cooler here in Santa Fe than other parts of the country, but Isaac couldn't sell me a free air conditioner in the middle of July. I mean, he is not coercive or controlling. He does not demonstrate any of those traits. I mean, if anything, he was just scared and didn't know what to do, and was just kind of agreeing with this narrative that Detective Vigil was shoving down his throat. Now, as far as the forensics, Dr. Helmer did prove that there was a homicide. She did explain that. She didn't say anything about Isaac's guilt. Grace had more than 20 sharp force injuries, but pathology did not identify Isaac as a killer. Dr. Helmer could not determine the exact time of death scientifically, but stated that it took around 2 minutes. The pronounced time of death, I mean, it was not the actual time of death, she wasn't sure, but Sergeant Vigil admitted that he didn't do any independent forensic analysis to determine how long the attack took, and he kind of just told Isaac, it wasn't 30 seconds to 2 minutes, and Isaac just was basically admitting to anything that Detective Vigil was telling him. But Emily Helmer, the witness, clearly testified that it did take about 2 minutes. This case, ladies and gentlemen, is about proof. It's not about suspicion. Again, guess, conjecture, speculation. That's not what it's about. It's not about suspicion. The case is not about whether something terrible happened to Grace. It did. The case is about whether the government proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Isaac knowingly took part in it. The evidence points towards Kiara, her sword, her jealousy, as we'll get into, her planning, her hands, her DNA, her fingerprints, her flight, her cleanup, and her ultimate rage that had been building up for many, many months and years. Evidence does not point to Isaac Apodaca. This is a tragedy, but it's not proof. of anything involving Mr. Apodaca. State proved, we'll acknowledge, and I told you this in opening, that some of our arguments kind of overlap. The state did prove that Grace Jennings died by homicide. It did not prove, the state did not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Isaac Apodaca is legally guilty of first-degree murder or an accessory to any sort of murder or guilty of any sort of conspiracy. The case agent admitted no evidence, Detective Vigil, no evidence has been presented that Isaac was in the garage when Grace was killed. Isaac had no blood on him, no cuts on his hands, that Sergeant Vigil could remember, and no blood on his clothes. Laney McCulley did not witness the garage events, did not see Isaac harm anybody, and had no personal knowledge of what happened in that garage. Laney did not know whether the garage door was locked that morning. Now, Kiara and Grace had a deteriorated relationship. Laney agreed. She testified that Grace could easily provoke Kiara. The sword was associated with Kiara's Amazon account, and Kiara opened it in front of her mom, Laney. As far as Kiara's credibility is concerned, I mean, you heard her testify. She had, again, the Archangel Gabriel, the vigilante group. I mean, this is all ridiculous. Absolutely no evidence was presented of any sort of group, let alone ghost group or any of that, let alone any of this being discussed between Isaac and Grace. I mean, those claims may explain Kiara's current narrative, convenient narrative, whatever you want to call it, but they do not eliminate reasonable doubt when it comes to Mr. Apodaca. Kiara had always liked swords. Kiara's mother was a member of a medieval sword club. Kiara grew up around a strong woman. Laney, I think we can agree that her mom was a strong person, saw how she testified. Isaac, on the other hand, needed a place to crash, needed a place to stay, and he was at their mercy. Needed to agree with anything that Laney and Kiara wanted. Needed to acquiesce. And again, I keep, now they use the word acquiesce. Mere presence, and you can't prove accomplice liability merely by presence or acquiescing. It has to be based on the elements that are presented to you. So it's important to ask, where is Mr. Apodaca in all this? Again, the weapon, Kiara's DNA and fingerprints were clearly present on the sword, as Emily Helmer testified to, Dr. Helmer. Isaac's DNA and fingerprints were completely absent. He was calm, cooperative, somewhat, until, I mean, certainly he was nervous and disturbed about what happened, but he was certainly shaken up about what happened around him, but there was absolutely no blood on Mr. Apodaca. There were no cuts, no scratch. I mean, there was the little scratch that Mr. Apodaca described was a product of Ms. McCulley poking him with the sword, but there were no significant injuries indicative of any sort of bloodshed that would be, or a byproduct of anything that would be a result of a stabbing of that nature. Now, again, DNA, as I showed you, was present on the sword handle. Kiara's fingerprints were present on the sword handle. Grace's DNA was present on bloodstains from the actual blade of the sword. Isaac's DNA was not present on the sword. Isaac's fingerprints were not present on the sword. And based on fingerprints and DNA results, Kiara would have had to have handled the sword with both hands, as I demonstrated to you when they're showing the right middle finger and the left palm. I mean, Isaac's DNA and fingerprints were virtually absent from all critical evidence in this case. His fingerprints were not found on the sword sheath, dagger, or dagger sheath. His DNA was eliminated from the sword blade, Grace's blood, sword handle, the blue sweater with Grace's blood on the cuff, the tissue with Kiara's blood, all of the wall and bedding swabs with Grace's blood, and most critically, from both of Grace's fingernail clippings, including the DNA under the fingernails. So there was nothing linking Isaac Apodaca. And I think it's also important to note that Kiara had all these conflicting, crazy stories, right? She's talking about how Isaac had handed her the sword at once. I mean, she had a more trimmed down testimony here when she testified before you, but then I talked to her about her previous interviews and different wild accusations she made about Isaac handling the sword or swinging the sword or different things. But as the evidence played out and as she was prepared either for trial or for interviews as they progressed, she changed. I mean, initially she talked to the officers or Detective Vijo without her attorney present. She didn't have an attorney at that time. And she didn't really say anything about Isaac. Then she was charged, and all of a sudden she has these wild allegations against Mr. Apodaca. Wild stories. And then, of course, she conveniently took a plea right after that. And she had her attorneys present with her during that interview. And then the third time, in the third interview, with myself present here in actually this very courtroom, I believe, and Mr. Meek, my investigator, present, she toned that back a little bit. And then before you here yesterday, she had another term version after she was prepared to testify before you. And then the drinking. She had initially said that she had a few sips of alcohol. Then actually, when she had her attorneys present and she was talking to the state right before she took a plea agreement, she said she drank a bottle and a half of Jack Daniels. Okay? I'm not an expert on alcohol use. I hope I'm not. But I mean, I would think that a bottle and a half of Jack Daniels over the course of a day is an extreme amount of alcohol. How can we believe that she remembers anything? Oh, my doctor testified that Grace was underweight and was about 111 pounds, I think. 111 pounds, 5'9". Bottle and a half of Jack, or initially she said a few pints right before she got arrested, or a few sips, excuse me, and then yesterday she said a pint. Ladies and gentlemen, jury, her testimony cannot be taken seriously at all. Completely contradictory between every interview she did, and likelihood is she may just have been really, really drunk. I don't know. Maybe that would explain why she stabbed somebody to death several times. I mean, someone with a deep level of anger like that must have come with an extreme level of provocation. Now, CSS Tenna did a great job with the forensic report. You saw that with the forensic work, and did not put Isaac's DNA on the sword or anything that links him to this killing. As far as Kiara's, again, no blood on Isaac. As far as the bloodshed, there were no Band-Aids on Isaac. A Band-Aid box was found in the detached garage. Kiara had Band-Aids on her. That evidence is consistent with Kiara handling the weapon, not Isaac. State's trying to point and basically paint Isaac in the worst light possible, but there's absolutely no evidence of him having any sort of involvement in this case. Kiara's the one who discussed this big, or maybe she didn't say big, but she said beautiful sword. Stated that her mom taught her how to use swords. And then she lived out her fantasy after getting her own sword. Kiara's mom, again, was a part of these sword clubs, and Kiara testified that her mom was almost like a mentor to her. So basically, it comes down to this. I mean, the sword is the central object in this killing. Kiara's on the sword, Grace is on the blade. Isaac is nowhere to be found as far as any sort of DNA or anything. Motive and rage belong to Kiara here. Kiara was jealous of Grace and Isaac. Kiara acted out of rage and extreme provocation by Grace. Grace had provoked Kiara over the years. And Kiara told Grace to apologize, and she stabbed her to death. And that's also important to note. When you're standing over, I'm not going to be dramatic with the sword in regards to this. I mean, this is serious stuff. But, I mean, Kiara is standing over Grace, asking her to apologize. I think you need to think about that for a second. If they're saying that Isaac Apodaca somehow coerced and controlled or caused Ms. McCulley to do this, are we supposed to believe that when she's basically standing over her with the sword and telling her to please apologize, and then she'll stop? I want you to think hard and deep about that. I mean, using a sword, as my co-counsel, Mr. Cameron, pointed out, I mean, using a sword in this case demonstrated that Kiara was up close and personal with Grace. It's not like somebody shooting a gun from a distance or anything like that. It's up close and personal with this sword. You're stabbing somebody in close range. I can't stab you from over here. I can throw a sword at you, but I can just stab you from over here like I could shoot you with the gun. Sword killing is an intimate, violent, and personal act. Post-mortem wounds. Mr. Cameron also got into that. According to OMI, all 7 wounds on the head and neck were post-mortem after death. OMI testified that the post-mortem wounds could have also killed Grace had she been alive. Ladies and gentlemen, This killing took place with so much rage, so much anger, so much passion, right, Ms. McCulley? And how are we to believe that Isaac somehow coerced and controlled her to do this? It's ridiculous. It doesn't add up. Kiara's contradictions and Laney McCulley's motive to protect her daughter, they were the ones who orchestrated, Laney McCulley did not orchestrate this, but clearly they were the ones who were coercive and controlling over Mr. Apodaca. Mr. Apodaca may have just been maybe sending some messages in agreement or whatever because he just needed a place to crash. And of course, let's get to Dr. Wellner. Dr. Wellner is a red herring in this case, ladies and gentlemen. He's a red herring. The case, we believe, is a weak case for the state. The state is trying to make you believe that Isaac was somehow coerced and controlled, somehow coerced and controlled Ms. McCulley. So then they bring in Dr. Wellner. The government wants to explain all of this bloodshed, the state, through this coercion and control. The sword, the DNA, the fingerprints, the band-aids, the washer still running, the flight, the jealousy, the postmortem wounds, point to Kiara acting alone. The physical evidence, again, does not put Isaac on the sword. Isaac had no blood on him. Isaac had no real cuts. Kiara ran while Isaac cooperated. Kiara had the sword, the motive, the planning, the DNA, the fingerprints, and the rage. Dr. Wellner's so-called expert testimony, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, should be taken with a grain of salt. And I don't normally say that he's an expert. I understand that. But as I told you earlier, he travels the country. He was flown in here from Palm Beach, Florida, to testify for the state. He was paid by the state to make this argument without interviewing the subjects of this situation, without looking into or finding out any real detail about that 2022 case that was dismissed. And then he also goes into this analysis about the stuff about, all this stuff, the sex work and all this stuff. Those are all red herrings, ladies and gentlemen. None of that should be considered. It's not an instruction. Again, there's also an expert opinion jury instruction. And it's up to you to determine the weight that deserves. And I'll tell you this, Dr. Wellner's testimony deserves absolutely no weight. So, ladies and gentlemen, the government did not prove that Isaac committed the crimes alleged here. Kiara ordered the sword. This was a result of jealousy. Suspicion is not proof. Association is not proof. Being near Kiara is not proof. Again, mere presence is not alone. Joking around is not proof. I don't want to use the term hyperbole, but there are certainly, we can't really take these messages. We got to take the messages in its proper context. Grace Jennings was Isaac's ex-girlfriend with whom he maintained a friendly relationship. Grace proactively contacted Isaac seeking a place to stay, welcomed her into their house. There was really no evidence of any real pre-existing conflict between Isaac. There was certainly pre-existing conflict between Kiara and Grace, but nothing between Isaac. So, I guess there was, you can talk about real world intent and these text messages, text-based puffing. In the text stream at 12:54 a.m., Isaac explicitly told Kiara in the text stream to show compassion and reject violence. Then there's that bizarre message about, that the state wants to talk about with moving up the rank, the black market heads and Bitcoin payouts and all of this. That's just basically an echo chamber. It's not anything that's legitimate in regards to any sort of intent that Mr. Apodaca had in regards to do anything towards Ms. Jennings. Isaac explicitly texted at 5:59 a.m., yes, I want to help, but I cannot coach you to do. But then he backed out. He said, she has a volatile partner. She's going through delusions. It's basically telling her what she wants to hear. She's like, I cannot aid you. He doesn't want anything to do with this. Isaac generally tried to de-escalate the matters and discussed a nonviolent strategy. The text messages, I'm not going to sugarcoat them. They're certainly disturbing, especially considering what happened here. But there's nothing showing that these messages was any sort of legitimate acknowledgement by Mr. Apodaca that he was intending, encouraging, or causing, as Ms. Murphy articulated, there was nothing that he was intending, encouraging, or causing Kiara to commit the crime. And again, ladies and gentlemen, remember, mere presence or acquiescence alone is not enough to find somebody guilty of murder as an accomplice. This was about Kiara's beautiful sword. This was Kiara's plan, Kiara's jealousy, Kiara's rage, Kiara's flight, Kiara's cleanup, Kiara's DNA, Kiara's fingerprints. This had absolutely nothing to do with Isaac's knowing participation. No proof beyond a reasonable doubt was clearly presented here. So the state, they did prove a tragedy here. They did prove suspicion, but they did not prove that Isaac Apodaca is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Only verdict here, ladies and gentlemen, is not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of second-degree murder, and not guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. The state is asking you to ignore essentially what is missing in this case and look away from what is present. For you to determine whether somebody is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, you have to look at the evidence, but also the absence of evidence, which is very glaring in this case. Only verdict here, ladies and gentlemen, is, again, not guilty of all the counts. Thank you for your time. And on behalf of my defense team, Mr. Cameron, Mr. Apodaca, and Mr. Meek, we appreciate the work that you've done and you're putting into this case. Thank you.
This concludes today's proceedings in State of New Mexico versus Isaac Apodaca. The trial continues as both the prosecution and the defense present evidence, question witnesses, and make their arguments before the court. The case has not reached a final verdict, and Isaac Apodaca remains presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Stay tuned for continued coverage of the proceedings and future trial updates.